9 years. 9 long years since that evening, and not a single one of my riding buddies believes my account. Hell, I wouldn't believe myself if someone recounted this tale to me. But I'm sharing it regardless, because what occurred out there in the Cascade Mountains altered everything I believed I understood about what's concealed in the dense wilderness of Oregon State. My name's Kent, and I've been riding for over 15 years now. I've traveled through every state, witnessed all kinds of bizarre incidents on the highway, intoxicated motorists, high-speed pursuits, even a comet display that illuminated the heavens like New Year's Eve. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I confronted that November evening in 2015. It was a Wednesday when my contact, Tony, called me with an opportunity. Tony's one of those individuals who's been in the underground business since cell phones were the size of bricks. Raspy voice, constant stubble, and connections that run deeper than anyone cares to inquire about. Tony had a special job for me, off the grid. I'd handled off-the-grid work before, the kind of business that requires someone who can move fast, travel light, and stay invisible. The kind where you don't ask too many questions about what you're carrying or where it came from. This assignment was different. I needed to get to a remote location in the Cascade Mountains, make a pickup, and deliver it to a contact outside Portland. Tony wouldn't tell me what I was carrying, said it was better if I didn't know. But he was paying enough that I didn't press for details. The customer was offering serious money, cash. One evening's ride, $25,000 in my account, $25,000. That was more than I made in 6 months of legitimate work. My bike payments were overdue, rent was behind, and I had some debts that needed settling with people who weren't known for their patience. The pickup location was an abandoned logging site about 40 miles southeast of Bend. My task was simple transportation, collect the package, transport it to a contact outside Portland before daybreak. In and out, smooth and silent. I should have declined, should have told Tony to find someone else for his mysterious deal. But $25,000 was $25,000, and I convinced myself it was just one evening, one ride, and nobody would be harmed. Tony handed me half the compensation up front in cash and detailed directions to the collection location. The remainder would come when I delivered. The strategy was uncomplicated. Depart Portland at 10 p.m., ride to the collection location, grab the package, and reach the contact before sunrise. The route would take me through some of the most isolated areas of the Cascade Mountains, but my bike, a 2014 Kawasaki Ninja 1000 that had never failed me, could handle it. I'd ridden that bike over 80,000 miles without a single major malfunction. She was dependable as clockwork, with an engine that purred like a satisfied cat and brakes that could halt on a dime. If I was going to do something this dangerous, at least I was doing it on a machine I trusted entirely. The journey started normally enough. I-84 east to the Dalles, then south on Highway 97 toward the mountains. Traffic was sparse, just a few late-night travelers and the occasional highway patrol. I maintained my speed precisely at the limit, trying to appear like just another rider making an overnight trip. But as I turned off 97 onto the smaller routes that would take me deeper into the mountains, the terrain began to transform. The towns and small communities gave way to thick forest that pressed in on both sides of the roadway. Ancient ponderosa pines and Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so dense that my headlight seemed to barely penetrate the darkness between the trees. The GPS on my phone started malfunctioning around 11:30 p.m. The signal kept cutting in and out, and twice it attempted to route me down paths that didn't exist. I had to rely on the handwritten directions Tony had provided, following a series of increasingly narrow and twisting roads that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the wilderness. 2:15 a.m. when I hit whatever was lying across the roadway. I remember the precise time because I was checking my watch, calculating whether I'd make the pickup on schedule. The collision wasn't enormous, felt like running over a substantial branch or maybe a medium rock. But on a motorcycle, even small things can be catastrophic. Within minutes, I could feel the bike handling differently. The rear was sliding slightly in the turns, and I could hear that telltale thumping sound that every rider fears, a blown tire. I pulled over to the shoulder and shut off the engine. I climbed off and walked around to assess the damage. Sure enough, the rear tire was completely destroyed. Whatever I'd struck had torn a gash in the sidewall that no amount of sealant was going to repair. That's when the reality of my situation hit me. I was on a motorcycle in the middle of nowhere with a blown tire and no way to fix it. Unlike a truck, I couldn't carry a spare tire. My only options were to call for help or find help. My cell phone showed no signal, not even emergency service. I was completely, utterly isolated. I stood there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest so thick it felt like being at the bottom of a canyon, with a disabled bike and no way to repair it or call for assistance. I spent the better part of an hour attempting to devise alternatives. Maybe I could ride on the rim. No, that would destroy the wheel and probably send me flying. Flag down a passing vehicle? In the 4 hours I'd been on these back roads, I hadn't seen a single other vehicle. That's when I noticed something in the forest. Deep in the trees, maybe a third of a mile off the road, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a building. Just the edge of a roof visible through the canopy, but it was clearly constructed. A house, or maybe a cabin. People meant tools, maybe even a phone that functioned, or at least someone who could help me get back to civilization. I grabbed my backpack and started making my way through the undergrowth. The forest was dense, full of fallen logs and tangles of bracken that caught at my boots. But the promise of assistance kept me moving forward. It took me 30 minutes to reach what I'd spotted, and what I discovered wasn't what I expected. There were 4 buildings arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. They looked like old logging cabins, the kind built back when timber companies established temporary camps deep in the forest. But these hadn't been temporary. They were substantial structures built to endure. What was immediately apparent was that they were completely deserted. No lights in the windows, no smoke from chimneys, no signs of recent habitation. The buildings had a weathered, forgotten appearance that suggested they'd been empty for years. I called out, asking if anyone was present and explaining that I had bike trouble and could use some assistance. No answer, just the sound of wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. I approached the largest cabin, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves that carpeted the clearing. The front door was standing slightly open, creaking softly in the breeze. When I used my phone's flashlight to peer inside, I could see the interior was basic but functional. A stone fireplace, some rough-hewn furniture, shelves that had once been lined with supplies. I called out again, stepping inside and apologizing for the intrusion while explaining my situation. Still no response. My light revealed that while the cabin was abandoned, it hadn't been empty for as long as I'd initially thought. There were signs of relatively recent occupation, preserved goods on the shelves, tools scattered about, and furniture that wasn't completely covered in dust. I started searching around for anything that might help. Tools, a phone, maybe even someone with a vehicle who could give me a ride. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with several rooms connected by narrow hallways. In what appeared to be a workshop, I found an impressive collection of hand tools, some spare parts for machinery I couldn't identify, and several items that made me increasingly uncomfortable about who might live here. There were chains, heavy ones with padlocks, animal snares of various sizes, including some that looked big enough to catch something much larger than a deer. And mounted on the walls were photographs, dozens of them, showing the forest from various angles with dates written on the back going back several years. But it was the most recent photos that made my blood freeze. They showed tracks, massive tracks, easily 3 times the size of my own boot, pressed deep into the mud near a creek. The photos were dated just 2 days ago. I was examining the photographs when I heard the first sound. It started as a low rumble, almost below the range of human hearing. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to come up through the floorboards and into my bones. At first I thought it might be a vehicle passing on the distant road, but it was too rhythmic, too organic. Then came the snap of breaking branches, somewhere outside and moving closer. I turned off my phone's light and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The clearing that had seemed empty and peaceful now felt threatening, full of shadows that might be hiding anything. The rumbling sound came again, closer this time, and I realized what it was. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, but not human. Whatever was making them was large, larger than any animal I knew of that lived in these forests. I backed away from the window, my heart starting to race. This was probably just a bear, I told myself. Black bears were common in the Cascades, and they could get pretty large. The tracks in the photos were probably just bear tracks that looked bigger in the mud. But bears don't sound like that when they walk. And bears don't typically approach buildings where humans have been living. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. Through the thin walls, I could hear whatever it was breathing. Deep, measured breaths that sounded disturbingly human-like. At one point, it paused directly outside the window where I'd been looking, and I heard a new sound, sniffing. Like a hunting dog tracking a scent, but much deeper and more resonant. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, heading toward the other buildings in the clearing. That's when I should have fled, should have bolted for the door and sprinted back toward my bike, blown tire or no blown tire. But curiosity and disbelief kept me frozen in place. I had to see what was out there. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept back to the window and peered out. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The body was massively built, not fat, but powerfully muscled like a heavyweight fighter, scaled up to impossible proportions. The arms hung nearly to its knees, ending in hands that looked capable of crushing a man's skull without effort. But it was the face that nearly made me pass out from shock. It wasn't quite human and wasn't quite ape. The features were heavy and primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that projected forward like a muzzle. But the eyes, God, the eyes were intelligent, alert. They swept the clearing methodically, taking in every detail. This wasn't some bear or elk or any other animal I could rationalize away. This was a Sasquatch, a real, living, breathing Bigfoot standing not 60 feet from where I was hiding. It moved with purpose, heading toward the third cabin. I watched as it approached the building and began examining it, running those massive hands along the walls like it was searching for something. When it reached the door, it stopped and tilted its head, listening. Then it looked directly at the cabin where I was hiding. Our eyes met through the window, and I felt something primal and terrifying pass between us. Recognition. It knew I was there, had probably known since it first approached the clearing. Those intelligent eyes studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression that it was deciding what to do about me. The decision was apparently to investigate further. The creature began walking toward my cabin with purposeful strides, and I knew I had seconds before it reached the door. The back of the cabin opened onto the forest, and I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. I ran. I crashed through the back door and into the darkness, my phone's light swinging wildly as I stumbled over fallen logs and crashed through underbrush. Behind me, I could hear the front door of the cabin being torn apart, not opened, torn apart with a splintering crash that echoed through the forest. Then came the roar. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, part human scream, part animal bellow, and completely terrifying. It was the sound of something big, powerful, and very, very angry. The chase was on, running through dense forest at night while being pursued by a creature that knows the terrain better than you do is not something I'd recommend. Every step was a gamble. A root that could trip you, a low branch that could knock you unconscious, a ravine that could break your neck. But the alternative was letting that thing catch me. And based on the sounds it was making as it crashed through the forest behind me, I didn't want to find out what would happen then. My phone's light died after about 15 minutes, leaving me stumbling through the darkness, guided only by moonlight filtering through the canopy. The creature behind me didn't seem to have any trouble navigating. I could hear it gaining ground, its footsteps shaking the earth and its breathing growing closer. I tried to be smart about my route, staying on animal trails when I could find them, and heading generally downhill toward where I hoped the road might be. But the Cascade Forest is a maze of ravines, fallen trees, and dense undergrowth that can turn a straight line into a zigzag nightmare. At one point, I thought I'd lost it. I'd been running for maybe an hour and a half, and the sounds of pursuit had faded. I stopped to catch my breath behind a massive fallen pine, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion. That's when I heard the sniffing again, much closer than I expected. The creature had been tracking me by scent, following my trail through the forest as easily as I might follow a marked path. I could hear it moving methodically through the underbrush, pausing occasionally to test the air. I forced myself to start moving again, but my energy was running low. I'd been running for hours, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was starting to fade. My legs felt like rubber, and I was making more noise than I wanted to as I stumbled through the darkness. The creature seemed to sense my weakness. Its pursuit became more aggressive, the crashing sounds getting closer and more frequent. At one point, I could feel the vibration of its footsteps through the ground as I ran. I was starting to panic, making poor decisions and wasting energy on routes that led nowhere. When I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine with no way across, I thought it was over. I could hear the creature approaching through the trees behind me, maybe 40 seconds away. That's when I saw the lights. Far below me, at the bottom of the ravine, I could see the faint glow of headlights on asphalt. A road, not the forest road where I'd left my bike, but some other route that cut through the wilderness. I didn't have time to look for a safe way down. I could hear branches breaking as the creature closed in, so I half jumped, half fell down the steep slope, grabbing at trees and rocks to slow my descent. I hit the road hard, rolling and scraping my knees on the asphalt. But I was alive, and more importantly, I was on a surface where a human could outrun something that weighed 900 pounds. I picked myself up and started running down the center line, hoping against hope that a car would come by. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through the forest like a scar, but it was level and clear. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing down the slope I'd just descended. It was having more trouble than I had. Something that big doesn't navigate steep terrain as easily as a desperate human. I'd been running down the road for maybe 15 minutes when I saw the headlights approaching from ahead. A single car moving fast through the curves. I stepped into the middle of the road and started waving my arms, probably looking like a complete lunatic. The car was moving faster than whoever was driving realized. When the headlights illuminated me, I heard the screech of brakes and the squeal of tires as the driver swerved hard to avoid hitting me. That's when everything went wrong in a way I never could have anticipated. The car, a late model Toyota Corolla, swerved to miss me and went off the road to the right, clipping a tree and spinning back toward the center of the asphalt. The driver overcorrected and the car skidded sideways across both lanes before slamming into a massive ponderosa pine on the left side of the road. The impact was tremendous. The tree was easily 7 feet in diameter, and the car hit it at probably 50 miles per hour. The front end crumpled like an accordion, and steam started pouring from under the hood. I ran toward the wreck, ready to help the driver, when I heard something that made me freeze in place. The creature's roar, much closer than I expected. It had reached the road and was charging toward us, drawn by the noise of the crash. In the glow of the car's headlights, I could see it clearly for the first time, all 10 feet of it, covered in dark brown hair and moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. The creature was focused on the car, perhaps seeing it as a threat or simply investigating the source of the commotion. It approached the wreck at full speed, and what happened next was like something out of a horror movie. The Toyota had come to rest with its passenger side against the tree, and the creature apparently didn't see the obstacle. It hit the car at full speed, its momentum carrying it forward into the tree with a sickening crunch that I felt in my bones. The impact was so violent that it shook needles from the branches overhead. The creature's massive body was pinned between the car and the tree, and after a moment of thrashing, it went completely still. I stood there in the middle of the road, hardly able to believe what I just witnessed. The creature that had been chasing me for hours was apparently dead, killed by its own momentum when it crashed into the accident it had indirectly caused. But my relief was short-lived. I could hear moaning from inside the car. The driver was alive but hurt. I ran to the car and peered through the spider-webbed windshield. The driver was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, slumped over the steering wheel with blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. She was unconscious but breathing, and I couldn't see any obvious life-threatening injuries. The car door was jammed, but I managed to force it open and check her vitals. She had a pulse, and her breathing seemed steady. The blood was from a superficial cut where she'd hit the steering wheel, and while she probably had a concussion, she didn't seem to be in immediate danger. The creature, on the other hand, was clearly dead. Its massive body was wedged between the car and the tree, and its neck was bent at an angle that left no doubt about its condition. In death, it looked even more imposing than it had in life. Easily 900 pounds of muscle and bone that had been moving through the forest with predatory grace just minutes before. I should have stayed with the injured driver, but panic was setting in. I needed help, medical assistance for the woman, and frankly, I had no idea how to explain what had just happened. Who was going to believe that a Bigfoot had chased me through the forest and accidentally killed itself in a car crash? I started running down the road again, leaving the accident scene behind. After about an hour and a half of walking and jogging, I saw lights ahead. Not headlights, but the steady glow of a small town. Millfield was barely worthy of the name town. Maybe 150 people, a general store, a diner, and a tiny sheriff's office that probably handled more noise complaints than actual crimes. But it had a phone, and more importantly, it had people who could help. I burst into the sheriff's office at 5:15 a.m., probably looking like I'd been mauled by a bear, which wasn't far from the truth. I explained to the deputy on duty, a young guy who looked like he'd been dozing at his desk, that there had been an accident about 12 miles north on Mountain Route 23. A woman was hurt, and there was something else he needed to see. The deputy took down the basic information and called for an ambulance. Within 20 minutes, we had a small convoy heading back toward the crash site. An ambulance, a fire truck, and the deputy's patrol car with me riding shotgun. But we never made it to the accident. About 6 miles from town, we encountered a roadblock that hadn't been there when I'd passed through earlier. 2 black SUVs were parked across the road, and several men in dark suits were directing traffic away from the area. The lead agent informed Deputy Jenkins that there was a federal investigation in progress and the road was closed until further notice. When Jenkins protested that he had an injured motorist up there and needed to get medical assistance through, the man replied that the situation was being handled and ordered us to turn around and return to town. Jenkins looked like he wanted to argue, but something about these guys suggested they weren't local Forest Service or even FBI. They had an authority that went deeper than badges, and the equipment they were using looked military grade. When I asked what kind of federal investigation was happening, the man looked at me for the first time, and I had the distinct impression that he already knew who I was and why I was there. He simply stated that it was classified and repeated his order for us to turn around. We had no choice but to return to town. The ambulance and fire truck were turned back as well, and Jenkins spent the next hour on the radio trying to find out who had authority over whatever was happening on Mountain Route 23. He never got a straight answer. By sunrise, I was sitting in the diner in Millfield, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made with motor oil and trying to process what had happened. Jenkins sat across from me, his incident report half finished, asking me to clarify my story. I'd been trying to figure out how to answer his questions for hours. The truth sounded insane, but I couldn't think of a lie that would explain everything that had happened. I told him I thought it was a bear, a really big bear that got aggressive when I disturbed its territory. Jenkins nodded like that made sense, which it sort of did if you ignored the details. When he asked about the bear being hit by a car that crashed into a tree, I confirmed that was roughly what happened. Jenkins finished writing his report, but I could tell he wasn't entirely satisfied with my story. There were too many gaps, too many details that didn't quite add up. He mentioned that the federal agents would probably want to talk to me since whatever they were investigating up there might be related to my accident. But the federal agents never came to talk to me. In fact, as the morning wore on, it became clear that they had no interest in my story at all. A tow truck was allowed through the roadblock to retrieve my disabled bike. Apparently, my tire had been repaired and the bike moved to a service station in Bend. By noon, I was back on the road, heading toward Portland with no package and a story I couldn't tell anyone. I never did make that pickup. When I called Tony to explain what had happened, he was surprisingly unconcerned about the loss of the job. He simply said that sometimes runs go sideways and there was nothing I could have done about it. But when I pressed him for details about who had arranged the pickup and what I was supposed to be carrying, he became evasive. He advised me not to ask too many questions about that particular job, mentioning that some clients prefer to keep things quiet. I started to suspect that the whole operation had been a setup, that someone had wanted me in those woods at that particular time for reasons I couldn't understand. But why? And who? I tried to research the area where everything had happened, looking for information about the abandoned cabins and what might have operated there. What I found was frustrating. The land had been owned by a series of shell companies and government entities, with ownership changing hands frequently over the past several decades. The cabins themselves didn't appear on any official maps or property records. As far as the government was concerned, they didn't exist. The incident with the injured driver also disappeared from official records. When I called the state patrol to check on her condition, they had no record of any accident on Mountain Route 23 that night. According to them, nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. The woman had been real. The crash had been real. And the creature, God help me, had been real too. 9 years later, I'm still riding, still taking legitimate jobs that keep me far away from the Cascade Mountains. I've told this story to a few people. Close friends, family members, other riders who've shared their own strange experiences from the road. Nobody believes me. They listen politely, nod in the right places, and then change the subject. A few have suggested I might have hallucinated the whole thing. Too much stress, too little sleep, maybe some kind of exposure that affected my perception. But I know what I experienced that night. I know what chased me through those woods, and I know what died in that crash. I also know that some very powerful people went to a lot of trouble to make sure the incident never became public knowledge. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether Sasquatch exists. I know it does. The question is why the government is so determined to keep it secret, and how many other people have had encounters that have been covered up or discredited. I've done some research over the years, looking into other Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. What I've found is a pattern: credible witnesses whose stories are dismissed, physical evidence that disappears, and government agencies that claim to have no knowledge of anything unusual. But every now and then, I find someone whose story matches mine, someone who encountered something impossible and found themselves up against forces more powerful than they could understand. We're out here, the people who've seen the truth. We know what's hiding in the deep woods, and we know that someone or some organization is working very hard to make sure the rest of the world never finds out. I still ride the highways and back roads of America, taking jobs from coast to coast. But I'm more careful now about which work I take and which routes I travel. I avoid the deep forest whenever possible, especially at night, and I never ever take mysterious jobs from clients I don't know. Sometimes when I'm riding through remote areas, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the tree line. just a shadow, just a suggestion of something large and bipedal. But I don't stop to investigate, and I don't slow down. I keep my bike properly maintained, my phone charged, and my emergency gear ready. And when other riders share stories about strange encounters on remote highways, I listen without judgment. Because I know the truth that most people aren't ready to accept. We're not alone out here. There are things living in the wild places of America that science hasn't cataloged and the government doesn't want us to know about. I saw one of them die that night on Mountain Route 23, pinned between a Toyota Corolla and a ponderosa pine tree. But I also know there are others out there, moving through the forests and mountains, staying just out of sight of the human world that has encroached on their territory. And sometimes, late at night when I'm riding through country so remote that my headlight is the only illumination for miles, I wonder if one of them is watching me pass, remembering the human who witnessed their secret and lived to tell about it. The road goes on, and so do the mysteries it holds. But I'll keep riding and keep watching for signs of things that officially don't exist. Because 9 years ago, I learned that the world is bigger and stranger than most people imagine. And once you've seen the impossible, you can never quite look at the empty spaces on the map the same way again. That's my story, believe it or don't. I've learned not to care what people think. But if you're ever riding through the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest and you see something that shouldn't exist, remember what I've told you. And whatever you do, don't stop to investigate. Just keep riding and hope it doesn't decide to follow you home. If you're interested in more stories like this, check this one out.